Now I have the pleasure of handing the mic back to Evan Miyazono, the head of the Protocol Labs research team, to leave us with some closing remarks about upcoming efforts for funding the Commons and the future of Protocol Labs public goods. Take it away, Evan.
Good to be back. I have spoken at length on a number of different areas. I wanted to take this opportunity to try and gather some of the threads back together and provide a more unifying framework now that you've seen all of the various talks. Or maybe if you're catching bits and pieces of this will be a nice framework for you to have a better sense of what you'd like to go back and follow up on, dig into more deeply. And I have a few minutes of things that I personally and my team are working on, if anyone would like to engage more deeply on those. So overall, we've been talking about public goods, common goods, networked goods, borderless goods, all very interesting, nuanced, and some very powerful future terms for the future moving forward. And I look forward to seeing their usage and adoption be developed. We're looking at supporting all of the above, and overall, I see the steps to doing this. I see our goal as doing this deterministically, effectively, and quickly. And to the extent that you want some strategy to do that actionably, I see really just these 3 steps where we identify outcomes we want to reach or avoid, map paths to them, deploy existing mechanisms, design new mechanisms, and at the end of that, hopefully end up with a world that is more like the world that we dream of living in the future. In terms of how we go about identifying outcomes, it's very easy to look at current technological or societal trends and imagine that we have a fairly rough road ahead. You can look at any one of these, extrapolate, and say that, for instance, atmospheric carbon dioxide could lead to us ending up in a Mad Max style dystopia, or we could end up in a world where we've realized the priorities that we as humans should have for our role in our surroundings, and we've collaboratively worked to express those preferences in the same ways that we have previously used capitalism to express preferences for higher GDP, things like that. If we can engage the civilization at the individual level, it seems like there are very few things that would be unaccomplishable with sufficient persuasion, probably an unrealistic amount of persuasion, but it's worth consistently recalling that we are frequently limited by our habits and performances, as Tom Kalil was mentioning earlier. And it's worth remembering that most of, if not nearly all of society, ends up being some intersubjective construct. It's easy to extrapolate AI progress and see us headed towards either a HAL 9000 world or a world where you have a synthetic being that you can form what we would currently call a human connection with, who can help you and help humanity do various things. You could imagine taking virtual reality and a metaverse and augmented reality and having this end up as something that's either deeply empowering to help teams work together and coordinate and feel and stay more connected, or be something that empowers isolation and empowers corporate control over our digital environment and our digital assets. You can imagine current BCI taking the path toward being used in extensions of this study that showed that fMRI lie detection is actually more effective than polygraphing, which is mildly terrifying. But if you could compare that against a possible future where BCI technology grants you superpowers, acts like magic, you can put on some headset type device and suddenly give intuitive commands to all of your devices and be more empowered at the individual level as a user than is reasonable to describe these days. And with each of these, it's important to note that we can have long-term goals, but those might end up being very, very disjoint from our short-term decisions. Richard Hamming, I failed to make a lot of friends because he would frequently ask people, what's the most important thing you could be working on? And then promptly ask them, what are you working on? Why isn't what you just described? And I think that the justifiable frustration that people would feel from that, from being asked and trying to answer both of those questions, is that people don't often have the sense that they can, or the clarity of path to be able to pursue the paths that they want. And so I like to describe this as humanity seems to be sleepwalking towards a dystopia. We're so focused on what's happening now and how to maintain sure footing for the next step that we don't get to look 10 steps or 10 miles down the path or 10 years to see where these paths that we're on are leading us. I also will frequently use the saying, no raindrop feels responsible for the flood, and describe human action, collective human action, as this incentive flow toward this human action flow toward down an incentive gradient. And sometimes we can have emergent behavior where you can convince yourself that no individual actor would want that, and yet everyone seems to be working towards it rather consistently. And if you want to see more on this, the Slate Star Codex post, Meditations on Moloch, I think gives a great example of it. Eliezer Yudkowsky's book, Inadequate Equilibria, also touches on a lot of this phenomenon where it's kind of I would say it's an aggregated aspect of Hanlon's razor. Hanlon's razor being, don't ascribe to malice that which can be equally well described with stupidity. I think that there are more charitable and more reasonable and more accurate framings, including this one from Goethe that translated roughly to misunderstandings and lethargy produce more wrongs than deceit and malice do. As a result, you have these situations where, like, no programmer writes a function to bomb a city, bomb a particular city. They would write a function that would be so well abstracted and structured that would take the right arguments, and it feels blameless to the individual to have built that thing. But on some level, it's important to at least empower people to feel that sense of responsibility over not just what they're doing and what they're delivering on a weekly or monthly basis, but the goals that those actions could be taking, the goals that those actions could be working toward on the 5 to 10 to 20 year basis or longer. This is all to say that we probably can choose to some extent. There is an important difference between risk and uncertainty. I would highlight that typically there are problems where you think something is, I guess I'll occasionally refer to the difference between building building a bridge and building a rocket. If you're building a bridge with sufficient amounts of nearly any material will work to get you across a reasonable sized gap. But there are some problems like getting a rocket into space where no matter what you do, you will never get to space with a wooden rocket. The math just won't end up working out without some like absurdly science fictional propulsion techniques or like other reasonable constraints being violated. And so I bring this up to say that there are certain problems where you know the distribution of potential outcomes, and there are other problems where you expect that the outcomes will be littered with unknown unknowns. And for those where there is less uncertainty and mostly risk, the probability distribution is therefore at least somewhat predictable. Then I think that it can be said that we can go through and start to map milestones on the paths to achieve these kinds of outcomes. And so whether that's something, you can sort of imagine that it might be easier to identify the steps toward a brain-computer interface that grants humans superpower like magical control over electronics. And you could imagine those concrete steps being more certain than something like human-compatible AI, for instance. That's not to say that you couldn't try to map milestones for both of them, but for some it might be harder than others. And it's important to take that sort of thing into account when you go about thinking about building out technological roadmaps. And there are many people who have been speaking about efforts to build out roadmaps. Many people who aren't participating here who are also pursuing parallel or collaborative efforts. But we think that the progress that can be made towards doing this more effectively is going to be a foundational block in trying to accomplish what we want in terms of reaching better futures more reliably and sooner. Once you have a roadmap and you have milestones, it's also important to be able to make sure that you can make the progress along those, because while sometimes knowing that those milestones exist is enough for people to see, understand, and change what they're doing as a result, oftentimes I would claim that just knowing isn't. We've talked through many mechanisms so far and many more to come. I'm pleased to announce that we're also launching Funding the Commons Hub.io, where we plan to list and coordinate existing implementations of and experiments on various mechanisms. And so if you have mechanisms you'd like listed, please reach out and let us know. Check out the website. And if you'd like to run experiments with these mechanisms, we'd also like to track those and have a collaborative database of progress, so that when people show up and want to, or when people who know about this site want to implement some experiment or implement some incentives, it can be very easy to evaluate what mechanism might be the right fit for the thing that they are trying to have built, the goal that they're trying to reach, and see pros and cons of various mechanisms that could be used. Once you have mechanisms, I think it's very important to not just, as I was saying, illuminate what the steps might be, but also de-risk contributions and also increase the likelihood that people get sufficiently rewarded. Juan had mentioned that the funding staircase for efforts contributing to networked goods is much more sparse at large capital amounts compared to the capital markets from venture and for-profit enterprises. And I really think that it's possible to shift the decision for people from, do I want to contribute to a public good, or do I want to get a lot of money for my skills and my labor, to something where it's much more optimized toward, do I want to be rewarded for my labor and contribute to something that does not add to public goods, or do I want to get similar rewards and be contributing to those public goods. The goal of the mechanisms is not just to deploy the funding to the best ideas or in the most reasonable amounts, but to also try to increase the infrastructural support and the amount of capital, and increase the general amount of capital that can go to these efforts, because as networked goods, the entire network should benefit from that, or from the creation or maintenance of that good. There are some very interesting open questions around how to structure these blue funders that Juan described in his talk that would be similar to the investor perspective of the venture and limited partner system that operates fairly well in capitalism. I think that there's an important goal in here of taking the most effective aspects of capitalism and building analogs for those that benefit public goods, and then setting them up so that rather than maximizing wealth creation or shareholder value or GDP, you have them aimed at the creation of networked goods that can be shared by, if not all, at least anyone who opts in. But that requires having better mechanisms for propagating value and deploying value from funders to people who are taking action and doing, like, building these public goods or collective goods. And we also need more robust mechanisms so that we can propagate rewards backward for people who have played integral roles in the creation, even if it's something farther upstream than being the team that's immediately deploying funding. And so there are directions that people have spoken about yesterday and today about how you can think about and build various mechanisms. It's important to note that, similar to the funding environment for for-profit entities, we don't need every funding mechanism arrow going to the right or every reward mechanism going to the left to be the same, but we do want them to have similar properties and be generally abstracted enough that they can be interoperable. This should be something that is decentralized enough that you can choose what mechanisms you want, but interoperable enough that we could have one consistent system that benefits from all the network effects that you would hope for from a centralized system without that centralization. We have multiple efforts, directions, ideas that we've seen touched on that point toward each of these 3 steps. And much of what I'm particularly working on was covered by some of the things that Juan spoke to, but I wanted to highlight a few things that Protocol Labs is working on specifically, or working on or helping with, and collaboratively trying to accelerate. I would be loath to not also add that we are hiring people ranging from startup operators, people who will coordinate with and deploy some of these mechanisms or help run conferences like this, for instance. Mechanism designers who can come up with, flesh out, and implement these mechanisms. Software developers, because most of these mechanisms do require tooling. Technical leads who can lead and operate these. There are some weirder things like there are some mechanisms that might involve the creation of things that could be considered unregistered securities. And if there are creative lawyers who want to try to help make sure that we can create networked goods and reward the creation of networked goods without running afoul of securities law, that could be very interesting as well. We also have these 2 roles, public good investors and org engineers, that I think are very hard to describe, but very important. These public goods investors would be analogous to these VCs and LPs in the capital model, where they are running these blue funds. They are setting them up, identifying ways of generating high impact and deploying funds, but they're doing so for the creation of networked goods. And organizational engineers, I think, is a term that I haven't done much spelunking on to see if it's used elsewhere, but I think that it will be important to have people who think long and hard about how to build the legal or corporate structures, how to, I guess, take systems for eliciting and aggregating human preferences across large amounts of humans and map that onto something that is recognized within DAOs or nation states or legal systems or financial systems in a way that we can integrate, learn from those existing systems, and yet still have novel systems that behave, or novel organizations that behave in the ways that we would want to better create these networked goods. If you or someone you know would be interested in applying for some of these, you're more than welcome to email commons@protocol.ai or apply to either the roles on this greenhouse page. Additionally, some of these roles don't have job listings. If one of them sounds interesting to you or someone you know, then feel free to apply to the "Don't see a role here" role, which acts as a very effective catch-all. I mostly wanted to close with a few additional mechanisms that I've been rattling around in my brain for a while, and these are much more scoped than that high-level vision. But I wanted to share these because I think that they're interesting and amusing, and I'd be very curious to work with you if you think that you'd be interested in supporting these as a funder, mechanism designer, experimenter, running some of these trials, or even a subject for some of these trials. One of these is value learning for corporations. There's a really great talk from Charlie Strauss about how corporations are the original paperclip maximizing AGIs. And if you take that premise, then you could imagine trying to run a simplified version of value learning on teams of humans in order to try to elicit some shared sense of like morality or like general values, so that you could have a company that wants something that isn't just stock price go up, for instance. Working on framing this out, and we have one team that offered to trial this, but I'd love to hear from more or other anyone who'd like to take a supporting role in that. Another one that Pooja mentioned that I'm a fan of is the fact that good decision-making processes do not always lead to good outcomes, and vice versa. And the same for bad processes and bad outcomes. There's a system where you can be more systematic about how you evaluate and score, measure, track the ability to predict and run good decision-making processes. And so I'd be very interested to mix Breyer scores from which I was introduced to in the book Super Forecasting, and try to use that to reward good decision-making and good prediction of what is important and what is less important for the development of technology, because oftentimes it would be very reasonable to map a robust definition of expertise to the accuracy and fidelity of your world model for the relevant systems. And so this could turn into a systematic mechanism for making people better researchers, engineers, at least along one or a small number of dimensions. Another proposal is the hidden grantmaker idea. I mentioned this to a few people. The overall idea is to use a discussion forum where you assign the role for some researchers as a grant maker, and then you set things up so that every proposal looks like a conversation, and every conversation can look like a proposal, and you can secretly surprise people with, this idea was great, you're getting funding, and see how people respond to that. I had a delightful conversation last night with a funder about this for the first time, who said that they thought this could be very liberating because they've had conversations before where people will just try to validate funders. Some researchers will try to validate every funder's bad idea, and in the hopes of getting funding for their own ideas. And with this anonymizing, it could be very interesting to see if you have novel human interactions in environments that may have robust information gaps between funders and researchers, or between funders and people who are trying to make progress against shared goals they have with the funders. Overall, those were a few proposals that I think are interesting. Let me know reach out to comments@protocol.ai if you think any of those are particularly interesting and would like to help. After that, I think if we can get to these first 3 steps, I think we have a fairly reliable path to building a better world, or at least a more reliable path than the one we're heading down currently. And we can be hopeful and collaborative and try and get there. Other than that, I would love to thank you all for your time, comments, and all of the future contributions that you will be making. And I especially want to thank my fellow organizers. Carla, you've been absolutely amazing. I think one of the speakers' comments about how they felt like they were on NPR, and the sheer level of eloquence and professionalism of running this event, I think really elevates it. And while we have organized this on slightly more notice than the November Funding the Commons, I hope that we have all of the details and relevant information set far in advance of the next Funding the Commons. We have already succeeded in setting a date, June 15th to 17th. We're hoping to have this in person, and you're more than welcome to follow any of these mechanisms to learn more information about where the next Funding the Commons will be. And we'll have a call for potential speakers as well. And if you'd like to follow along with any of the things that I or the rest of my team or Protocol Labs are working on, you'll find relevant links here. And thank you.